I invite you to return to your seats as we are about to commence with the program. And it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Reem Mussa. She's standing right behind me. She's a humanitarian advisor and coordinator of the forced migration team with Médecins Sans Frontières. And she will give us the honor of introducing this panel topics with her keynote. Reem, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, ich kann es wegmachen. Ja. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting us to this panel, and thank you for all the esteemed colleagues before me that pertinently raised the challenges that we face today in terms of the humanitarian landscape in which we all work. It's been mentioned many times today that on Wednesday there was a shipwreck off the coast of Greece of people that were seeking safety in Europe. We are concerned that as many as 500 people have been feared to be drowned. Frontex drones detected the overcrowded vessel at least 24 hours before the shipwreck. They had informed Greek and Italian authorities, and no rescue was immediately launched, and deaths were not prevented. I wish I could say that this shipwreck was an isolated incident. I wish I could say that this was an unpreventable tragedy. However, this is not the case. This is a pattern of death and suffering that plays out on a daily basis at the borders of Europe. This has been the deadliest 6 months at European sea and land borders in the last 6 years. And whilst the majority of deaths happen at sea, at less visible land borders, such as those with Belarus, we know that more than 40 people have died and 300 people have been missing over the past 2 years. Violence along migration routes has become the norm. MSF in various regions, whether in Europe or migration routes towards North America or Southern Africa, has found that violence and exploitation is continuously reported by our patients. The reported perpetrators are at times non-state actors and smugglers, but more and more we hear that states are among the main perpetrators. In some studies that MSF has conducted along migration routes, both towards Europe and North America, it is estimated that between 40 to 70% of this violence occurs at the hands of state authorities and police. This occurs often at forgotten sites, at sites that are invisible, at sites of detention, at borders, during pushbacks. However, we know that it's also found in our cities, amongst people living in precarious settings that live amongst us, but often we forget. For migrants who are pushed back and deported to countries such as Libya, Niger, and Mexico, they are often trapped in cycles of exploitation, precarity, and abuse. An MSF study in Mexico found that out of 80 patients returned to Mexico from the USA, up to 70% were at risk from kidnapping and torture after their deportation. In Niger and Libya, returned migrants are often left stranded at borders in deserts where they are at risk of death from dehydration. MSF works in various forms of detention and containment sites over the past 20 years. For example, in the detention centers in Libya, men, women, and children are detained in overcrowded cells with no light or ventilation and often no access to any health assistance, water, or food. Similarly, in containment sites, such as the EU-funded hotspots in the Greek islands or Australia's offshoring centres on the Pacific islands of Nauru, MSF has documented severe mental health deterioration, which is amongst the worst in all our mental health programs around the world, and often results in high rates of suicide and resignation syndrome amongst children. As I said, I wish I could say that this suffering was just forgotten, that it was just neglected. However, this suffering is constructed and ignored. States continue to double down on this harmful approach. In Europe, we know that states have reduced state-led search and rescue capacity, and they have blocked humanitarian assistance at sea, which has resulted in contributing to the tragedy we just saw a couple of days ago. And just a couple of weeks ago, massive reforms to asylum rules will make it more difficult for people to access protection, reinforces deterrence and detention at EU borders, and will probably lead to more pushbacks, deaths, and criminalisation of migrants and those that seek to assist them. According to a study done by Pickham, more than 250 people have faced criminal charges for providing humanitarian assistance to migrants across Europe. Many more have been detained, intimidated, and investigated. This is not just a threat to our humanitarian principles that we're discussing today. This is a threat to our whole of society. It is a threat to rule of law, and it is a fundamental threat to our values. The world today faces unprecedented displacement crisis. We will continue to see displacement that is fueled by the global challenges that we face and we are discussing today. UNHCR estimates that 110 million people have been displaced around the world. This represents 1 in 70 people around the world. This is more than 90% of these people remain in low and middle income countries, and more than half of them remain as IDPs. Meanwhile, the international humanitarian system is not equipped to support refugees and displaced people. UNHCR reported at the end of last year that they have more than a 65% funding gap for the joint refugee response in over 12 critical crises. This will disproportionately impact many crises that are far away from our headlines. Displaced people in Burkina Faso and DRC and South Sudan or Chad or Uganda. Children and women malnourished in Yemen. Displaced Syrians in Lebanon, which are being pushed to return home prematurely. And displaced Venezuelans or Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh that have no home to return to. The impact we see on the ground is a real one. For example, in Bangladesh, Rohingya refugees who live in the world's largest refugee camp are completely confined and contained to the camp. They cannot leave, they cannot work, and they're completely dependent on assistance. Due to the funding gap, the World Food Programme has reduced food rations the 3rd time this year. This represents a cut from $12 to $8 per person. And this puts people at increased risk of malnutrition, greater risk of infectious disease, and health complications. Here too in Bangladesh, we face questions to our principles, questions of impartiality. The authorities continue to contain Rohingya in a camp in which their basic livelihoods are not met. They are refused legal status or rights, and they are pushed to return to Myanmar. Meanwhile, the international community fails to find a political solution. I say all this to say that displacement and migration will remain to be a reality and will remain to be a global challenge. And without a change in course and a true global collaboration, which addresses migration both at home and abroad, we risk losing our values, we risk losing asylum and migration, we risk our principles, and we put people at risk. Thank you. Will the other speakers join us? Should we go? Yes.
Yes, please, my panelists, don't be shy.
I hope my speech didn't scare everyone from joining me on the panel.
No, not at all. Thanks for your keynote. And you already set the tone of what we are going to do next. Again, hello everybody. Thanks for coming after lunch. We are talking about forgotten crises and forgotten suffering. You mentioned already some of the issues. And Franziska, if you allow me to introduce you first. You're a journalist, just like myself. Also, I should introduce myself. Thomas Seifert, my name. I'm a journalist as well. Michael, again, we already had Europeans here, which is fantastic. Thanks for being so present in Vienna. From ECHO, as you all know, European Humanitarian Assistance. And Peter Huber on the other end of my panel. He's all things development with the Austrian Foreign Ministry. And Reem, you already have met with the Keynote, working for MSF. So another fantastic panel. And Franziska, if you allow me to start with you, because also forgotten crisis, forgotten suffering what's the role of the media in this? Because if nobody hears about something, how can it be? It's not even forgotten. It's not even there. It doesn't even happen. Today, of course, the media landscape has changed dramatically. We have social media. We're not relying on journalists only. People can, show the situation on Twitter, on Instagram, on TikTok, on all sorts of media. At the same time, it seems to me, and this is my first question, attention spans shrink. And there is only so much, let's say, budget with people's empathy and also people's attention. So what do we do about that? What is your role as a journalist, as a storyteller, to let the world know what's happening? And also, how do you deal with the fact that maybe whatever you're working on, tomorrow something else, there might be an earthquake, there might be something, I mean, there's so much need in the world and so much news that people are bombarded with.
Yes, thank you so much for the question, and Reem, thank you so much for this keynote. I think that summarized everything so well on what we are facing at the moment. And I think I don't believe in the terminology of a forgotten crisis. I do think there are voices that are just rendered invisible. And as you said, we have a very strong role in the media to choose who we listen to choose who is spoken about. And while the title of this Congress today is non-negotiable, I think I would like to stay in Europe when it comes to migration, because my focus point is migration and forced displacement and the European migration policies. So also to answer your question, I'm focusing a lot on these topics. And I think what we can see at the moment is really a complete collapse of the rule of law on the borders. And the role of the media is definitely to shed light on this, to kind of see it, to document it, but also to keep a foot in the door for those who are more and more pushed into isolation, in detention centers, in high security camps, as you just mentioned, also through abductions, illegal pushbacks. The shipwreck we've seen yesterday in Greece is an example of, and that I would like to open it also for the audience, like how much did you hear from the people themselves, and how much do we speak about them, and who's analyzing it, and who's actually closing the door. And this is a very scary development that we see in the last years, more and more moving towards a situation actually that press freedom is also declining in this field. The same like there's a shrinking space in the humanitarian assistance. There is a criminalisation on migration in itself. So this is something that I would say we don't even have to look so far. We can just start in our neighborhoods and see, who's rendered invisible and who's also creating a crisis, right? And what is this crisis? Is it really, like, who's affected by the crisis and how is it manufactured? Because what we are seeing at the moment around these borders, from a journalistic perspective, is also the question, who's to be held accountable? And I think this is a combination that the media sometimes doesn't really, it's not so strong in combining what is happening, for example, yesterday, and seeing it as a reaction to policies that have been decided before that event, years ago, months ago. So I think this is something that I would like to focus more on when it comes to the media. It's like who's being heard, and to see all these events as a consequence of many events that happened before, also in the political sphere.
Okay. And Michael. Michael, also we have heard about various factors already on today, why people are forced to be on the move. And that's where I think the question comes in, how can we explain to European taxpayers in that case that we have, and we heard that word before, I'll say it again, responsibility to help and protect people when they are in need. And that is your job. And I'm wondering, is it for you, how difficult is it to, when it comes, for instance, to budget, because always it comes down to money, to explain to policymakers that this is important. It's not somewhere on a in some distant land, and anyway we can shut the borders, blah blah blah. But in fact, we need to do something. How easy is it for you to communicate that? And when you have your interactions, Do you think that, or sometimes maybe you have to remind people on a crisis that maybe they haven't heard of because somebody is not doing their job correctly? Maybe not the media, maybe other communication actors.
First, I would say it's almost too easy. One of the problems of humanitarian aid is that everybody loves it. If everybody loves it, nobody cares about it. When I go to the European Parliament, I have all the support that I want for humanitarian aid. But that's the problem. The problem is that there's no real debate about it. If there was more of a dispute between the left, the right, the center, the liberals, and so forth, if there was more fight about it, in a way, probably there would be more attention. The big danger of humanitarian aid is that people think it's nice to have. It's something what you do on a Sunday morning. We had a discussion this morning. Is it charity? Or is it a global responsibility? Or is it something that is essential? Now, looking at it from a donor perspective, I would say there's a difference between donors that define themselves as global donors and those who don't. And actually, to be honest, in the humanitarian area, there are only 3 global donors. First and foremost, the United States, then Germany, and then the European Union. All the other donors, including Sweden, the Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, Japan, that put sizable money, but all these others together represent only about 30% of the global donor effort. And if you look at Austrian humanitarian aid, despite all the increases, you will see that Austria is not represented worldwide. You select a couple of crises that you find important for domestic reasons, for historical reasons, perhaps, and so forth. So it makes it easier. For the global donors, it is important to be represented worldwide. Now, I can give you the example of the European Union, how we make sure that we don't fail on the principle of humanity, but also neutrality, by forcing upon ourselves a certain discipline not to forget about forgotten crises. The first thing is you need to define forgotten crises. If I think here in this discussion you would use interactive tools like Slido, and everybody would here participate, we would come to a cacophonia of definitions of forgotten crises. All of you will probably say, yes, of course, there are forgotten crises and we must not forget about them. But then when I ask you, what is the forgotten crisis for you, you would come probably to totally different results than I might come to or you might come to. There are, to my knowledge, 3 respected lists of forgotten crises that we are working on. One is ECHO's list. ECHO publishes every year a list of forgotten crises, and we have a self-commitment to dedicate at least 15% of our money to those forgotten crises. And in reality, we give more than the 15. But there's also a list which is published every year by Care International. And there's a list by NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council. Care, for example, focuses on the 10 most underreported crises. There we come to media attention. NRC, the 10 most neglected displacement crises. So it's more about displacement than about the humanitarian suffering as such. In ECHO, our methodology is more mixed. Our criteria are we want to have a list of crises that are severe, protracted, meaning they take longer than 2 years, humanitarian, where people receive insufficient or no international aid. We have a couple of tools that help us to come to those crises. For example, we have a severity index of the crisis. Every crisis in the world, 150 or so, and you know, the most severe ones are the ones we pay attention to. Then the number of people affected needs to be 30,000 or more. It needs to be at least 1% of the population of the country. We look at the finance, the international finance that is made available for this crisis on the basis of the OCHA financial tracking service. And we have a very interesting tool to measure the media coverage. We have a Commission media monitoring tool, the European Media Monitoring, that screens over 17,000 online information sources in English, French, Spanish, German, and Arabic. And from there, we come to a statistic that shows which crises are reported upon and which not. And then, of course, we look also at the assessment of our geographical experts and so forth. And that leads to very interesting results, Because, for example, in the EU index, in the ECHO index, you have a couple of countries that don't appear in the CARE or in the NRC index. Just to give you one example, in our index, every year you have the Central African Republic. You have Algeria, because of the Sahrawis. We have Myanmar. We have the Philippines, Mindanao, and so forth. These countries, these crises don't appear in the CARE or in the NRC indexes. But in the NRC index, for example, you would have Mali or Burkina Faso, which for us is not a forgotten crisis. So I think one has to put this a little bit in a perspective, not in order to find out who's right or who's wrong, but we need to avoid that focusing on forgotten crises is a false good idea. We need to first be aware, so to say, why we are talking about and what we are talking about. Secondly, we need to draw the operational consequences. And I think it is easily defendable as an operational outcome of the principle of humanity that you cannot pay 10 times more for a Ukrainian forcibly displaced person than for somebody, for example, from Mindanao. That is a logic that I think everybody in the European Parliament understands, and also in the member states. Of course, it is quite normal that donors, every donor in the world, pays more for the crisis next doors than the crisis far away. But we need to have this kind of self-discipline to make sure we don't forget about the crisis very, very far away. And finally, you know, forgotten crisis is a little bit like, in political science, one speaks about frozen conflicts. I don't really like too much the terminology because in reality, frozen conflicts get very quickly unfrozen. Nagorno-Karabakh was a frozen conflict by all means. It is no longer frozen. Neglected crises or forgotten crises can be unforgotten very quickly. For example, until January last year, on our forgotten crisis index, you had a country called Ukraine. Is it still unforgotten? Or Sudan, is it still unforgotten? So these crises simply don't have media light right now. The humanitarian suffering is there, but forgotten crises have a potential of reminding themselves of, simply because, you know, forgotten crisis means crises that don't marshal international political energy, where peace building is being neglected, and that can easily run out of control, lead to more humanitarian suffering, lead to infecting the entire region, as we see in the case of Sudan right now, and lead to security risks. And once you explain that to policymakers, including in the European Parliament, it is, again, a bit easier to mobilize funding for that.
Thank you. Peter, Michael has addressed something that is actually really also, I think, on your mind, and that is with limited resources of a small country like Austria, you have to pick and choose, right? You cannot be everywhere when you have pooled resources like on the European level. So maybe an interesting question, how do you do that? How do you make these decisions? Who needs our help first? Where can we do sustainable support? And how can we also, what we heard in the first panel this morning, at the end, we all want to be, at one point, nobody should need us anymore, as when you do in your work in 5, 6, maybe 10 years' time.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me, and thank you for your questions. Maybe let me start with one aspect. As a net contributor to the EU's budget, at least we can also with our limited resources support the work of a global actor with regard to humanitarian assistance, but we are fully aware of our role, and I think you quite pointedly marked this in your introduction. You made a very important point. We have to focus and focus our funds available. But how do we do this? And I think, first of all, with regard to the term forgotten, I'm also forgotten, frozen. With what you said, you know, some crises are pushed back from public attendance, but of course they are there because the people are suffering will not forget their crisis. We in Austria, first of all, have significantly increased over the last years, the funds available for humanitarian assistance. So a few years ago we were at 5 million, moved up to 15. Now we have 77.5 in the so-called disaster relief fund to assist in humanitarian crises. Additionally, we have 20 million euros for cooperation with the World Program, which plays also a key role in this conflict. So with this money, and if you look how we decided this year, we try to go there where we can have an impact and where our partners, I mean, with additional money available, it's also the relationship with the international community, with governmental actors, non-governmental actors, international organizations is a different one. But here I follow up on which conflicts you mentioned. For example, cooperation with non-governmental actors. We just recently passed, or the government passed a decision to provide 21 million euros for cooperation with non-governmental organizations. And in this context, we could react, for example, in Lebanon, in Jordan, you mentioned Burkina Faso, you mentioned South Sudan. I mean, are these crises forgotten? Particularly Sudan and its potential for a whole region is something that we try to have on our minds in our daily, weekly, and strategic planning over the year. But we are trying to react. Compared to non-governmental organizations, we are in this position that we have funds available if we want to market forgotten crises or forgotten catastrophes, and we try to channel money there.
Thank you very much. At this point, I want to bring in Bram Frouws from the Mixed Migration Center Director. Due to unforeseen circumstances, he couldn't make it to Vienna, but he has sent us a video message. It's a few minutes long, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, my friends back there that make that possible will bring it up, I think, in a minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel here today. Let me start with saying I'm really, really sorry I cannot be there with you in person today, as I was very much looking forward to. Not least because this is a really important discussion on the issue of forgotten crisis. As my focus is on migration, I would like to, of course, discuss the notion of forgotten crisis in relation to migration, and then raise a couple of points for reflection and discussion. Maybe to start with a main observation. When it comes to migration, like with anything else, whether it gets a lot of attention or might be forgotten really depends on where it's happening, or in the case of migration, where it's going to. When it's about migration towards Europe, migration is far from a forgotten crisis. You could even argue it's the opposite of forgotten. It's over-publicized, it's very vivid, it's over-represented. And it's already called a crisis, especially by media and politicians, before you could even reasonably argue it is a crisis. But the further you get away from Europe, that is often where the real crisis takes place. The crisis of migration is not when refugees and migrants arrive in Europe, usually in totally manageable numbers. The crisis is further away, also for those who may be heading towards Europe. Think about the Afghans who were killed at the border with Iran. Think about the thousands of migrants ending up in detention centers, for example, in Libya. Think about the deaths during the Sahara crossings in the Sahel. In 2016, for the first time, we published numbers and estimates concluding that a lot more people die during these kind of overland crossings as compared to the Mediterranean crossings. Of course, not to say that these kind of tragedies don't take place in the Mediterranean, as we sadly saw again this week off the coast of Greece. But there's a lot of focus on these deaths in the Mediterranean. So in all of this, there's an out of sight, out of mind dynamic at play, or maybe I should say tactic, at play. So the further you push these migration movements away from your borders, which tends to be the direction of a lot of the migration policy making these days, the more likely you make it a crisis, but also the more likely you make it a forgotten crisis. And even more forgotten are the migration dynamics that are not heading towards Europe at all, or towards the United States. So think about Mayotte, where the sea route from the Comoros is one of the most deadly migration routes globally. Or think about what we call the southern route from the Horn of Africa towards South Africa, where migrants may also die while in transit, and where they are met with a lot of violence and xenophobia upon arrival in South Africa. Now, another aspect I would really like to zoom in on here in the context of forgotten crisis is the situation of migrants and refugees in countries in conflict. They are really among one of the most forgotten groups. So right now, think of the millions of refugees and migrants who were already in Sudan before the current fighting started, like the many Eritreans, for example, or the Eritrean refugees in camps in Tigray, in Ethiopia when the war started there, or migrants and refugees in Libya. But a key example I would really like to draw the attention to here is Yemen. For more than a decade, an average of 8,000 migrants every month, mainly from Ethiopia, have been crossing from the Horn of Africa to Yemen, mainly to reach Saudi Arabia. 8,000 migrants a month, hundreds and hundreds of thousands in total. And their situation seems to be getting worse and worse. They experience an endless cycle of violence, abuse, exploitation, trafficking, slavery, and killings all along this route at every step of the way, on a scale that is probably only comparable to Libya, with one striking difference in the case of the Saudi Arabian-Yemen border, where migrants are deliberately killed directly by Saudi Arabian state officials. Yet they are even more forgotten than migrants in Libya, you could argue, presumably because it's far away from Europe, and the final destination of these migrants is Saudi Arabia, and it's not Europe. So this case of migrants in Yemen is really a forgotten crisis within a forgotten crisis, as Yemen itself is already a forgotten humanitarian crisis. Before I stop, I would like to reflect also a little bit on the word crisis in relation to migration. What I just described, the situation of migrants in Yemen or Libya, yes, that's a crisis for the migrants themselves. But this word crisis is also used too easily in relation to migration. And we have to be careful here. It creates a sense that things are out of control. And linked to this is the use of big numbers. We've seen a lot of statements and advocacy around reaching more than 100 million displaced people last year. We saw it again earlier this week. Well over 100 million displaced people, without good explainers that the majority of those are IDPs, internally displaced people, and that less than a third are refugees who cross the border. But then we see a minister a couple of months ago in the United Kingdom using this figure and saying there might be 100 million refugees coming to the UK. So that's how this kind of advocacy potentially backfires. Or take climate change and migration. When it's about people who might be displaced due to climate change or environmental factors, it's always the highest side of a massive margin of the estimates that will end up in the media headlines, and often accompanied by an automatic assumption that all those people will primarily move from south to north. So all of this creates a fear of migration and a sense of helplessness. It feeds into a crisis narrative where that's unhelpful, where it might backfire, and where it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the result is even more forgotten crisis, where there's a real migration crisis happening. Now, my focus is migration, as I said. So, of course, here I'm talking about how migrants and refugees tend to be forgotten. But there's also clearly a mobility bias. We focus a lot on people who are moving, especially those moving cross-border. But we also know that in almost every conflict and crisis situation, the most vulnerable people are those who are unable to move. And this is true in conflict situations, but also in the case of movement due to climate change effects. So that's not about migration, but it gets us back to forgotten humanitarian crisis more generally. That's probably a good moment for me to stop and hand it back to anyone else with a broader perspective. But just before I stop, some last reflections on the guiding questions on what can be done about this issue of forgotten migration crisis. On migrants in countries in crisis, there's actually a very good initiative, but it's a bit of a forgotten initiative, which is called the Migrants in Countries in Crisis Initiative, or MICIC, which provides guidelines, examples of good practices, how to respond. So that's something that should be activated whenever there's a crisis in which migrants get caught. We, also as humanitarians, have to be careful in our own advocacy to not feed into a crisis narrative where it's not needed or where it might actually backfire. And also important to keep raising awareness on the actual forgotten crisis. Our colleagues from the Norwegian Refugee Council, they have this annual overview of neglected crises, which I think is a very good initiative to maintain attention on some of these most forgotten crises. Finally, to a large extent, these crises are not so much forgotten by decision makers. Yes, they maybe are by the general public, but decision makers are generally very well aware of all the various crises that are happening around the world. The problem is how to mobilize the right attention and funding to adequately respond. And that is also very much a political issue, an issue of political will. That defines what becomes a crisis and what doesn't, and what becomes a forgotten or neglected crisis and what doesn't. So to end with something the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs, Johansson, said a few months ago in an interview, the refugee flows from Ukraine are maybe not even a crisis, I'm quoting here. So a few 100,000 refugees and migrants from further away are quickly called a migration crisis, but millions and millions of refugees from Ukraine, and it's not a crisis. And I think the difference here is the political will to respond in a certain way. I'll leave it at that. Again, I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you in person, also to be able to further reflect on some of these points and some of the points made by the other panelists. Hopefully I'm going to be able to be there next year. Thank you very much for your attention. And I wish you a great continuation of the discussion.
Yeah, but Bram really rattled off a long list of quite depressing news here from Sudan, Yemen, Ukraine, etc., etc. And that reminds me that this week the digital news report was presented as an international one and a national one. And one aspect of this is so-called news avoidance. So more and more people, we find out as journalists, avoid the news. And one topic is, for instance, Ukraine. People are not less and less interested in that. So Reem, when you had your keynote, I could also imagine that some people, some recipients of the media, if they see the stream, they also go like, oh, come on, again, all these depressing, sad stories that we just also heard from Bram, I'm kind of tuning out. I'm just look at my Instagram feed, there is fashion, there is some other things. What can we do? What is your answer to that? Because at the end of the day, the people need to be interested. It's not your problem as a humanitarian. It's not your problem as in a ministry. It's not your problem in the European on the European level. It's our problem. We all have responsibility. So I'm wondering, how can we? What do we do with that kind of information?
Yeah. So maybe I'll just take one step back because I want to react a bit to the conversation about forgotten, not forgotten that we've been having. I think the title of the panel is really interesting because it's forgotten crisis, forgotten suffering. And these things don't necessarily go together. As Bram, as everyone has said, there's many crises that are very well advertised or are constructed crises or exaggerated crises, like particularly the migration crisis. So it's not forgotten per se, and maybe as well, it's not even a crisis, right? But in that, there is suffering that is not prioritized, not cared for, not acknowledged, and not responded to. And that is what us as humanitarians should concentrate on. Whether something is on a list or not on a list, or whether it is identified, and of course these lists and these discussions and how even the news presenting some of these crises is very important. But I think as humanitarians we have to be very careful and cautious that we are not driven by this, that we are not driven by what is defined as a crisis by states. We do not react to the migration crisis in Europe in the way that states understand what is a crisis, because this does not put humanity and it does not put human needs at the center. That we do not react to the situation in Sudan today because it's a humanitarian crisis or it's seen as a crisis, but that we go back to fundamentally our values and go back to our humanitarian perspective, which is about prioritizing needs. And I think that many needs are never going to meet the news cycle, right? My origins are from a country called Eritrea. Eritrea is never in the news, and the needs of Eritrean people is not, unless it's a shipwreck in the Mediterranean Sea, and some of them happen to be Eritrean. But in the end of the day, that does not mean that those needs and the suffering or in these contexts are not important. And I think that we should be okay that not everything is going to be a news story, because our matrix of what is in the news versus what our priorities are as humanitarians are different. And I think that it's all too often, dangerously, that the news cycle does determine the humanitarian landscape, and it does determine the political landscape in which we work, and we have to push back against that. And we have to be consistent about making sure that the narratives of the forgotten suffering, rather than the forgotten crisis, is at the center of our humanitarian diplomacy, of our key messages, of our engagement, and of the kind of ways in which we make decisions as a humanitarian organization. And again, I want to put in the center, as we know very well, is very important, the role of funders and the role of government, but we also have to reinforce the independence of humanitarian actors. And we have to reinforce that even if humanitarian actors receive humanitarian funding from states, that they are able to independently channel and prioritize humanitarian needs to address this suffering that is not going to be prioritized by other actors. And I think that this is something that maybe we don't put enough emphasis on. And then on the point on the news cycle, we're not a good news story, you're right. But I think in this, there are good news stories in humanitarian work. Humanitarian work fundamentally is about humanity. It's about human resilience. It's about empathy. It's about cooperation. And in that, you can have a good news story without also reducing the truth of that story to diluting the accountability that's needed, that you touched on. The accountability of who is creating this situation, what is the political cost. And I think that it is important to bring the reality of the consequences, the human resilience, and the human cooperation, and the accountability to really tell the true story of what is happening in these contexts in which we work in as humanitarians.
Mm-hmm. Reem, thank you very much. And maybe Franziska, isn't there truth in what Reem just said, that basically if we look, of course all these are depressing stories, but if we look at the human aspects of it, how people even in adverse circumstance kind of make it, that we can identify with that then suddenly people who maybe tune out and say, I'm not interested, suddenly yes. Because empathy is there, and people are interested how this person or how these people manage to get out of the worst, and how they manage to survive, and how actually even in the worst circumstance this humanity is visible. Is that something? Do you think a strategy that would work with people who are avoiding the news, especially the bad news?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because I don't believe in the hero story. I believe in reality that is very complex, and that's the beauty in it, and that's the beauty of storytelling, and that's the beauty of encounter. If you are a journalist and you can meet people along the way, it's the beauty of having unanswered questions, of allowing a complex storytelling to happen. And then, yes, there's always the question, how do you engage the audience, right? But I think if you can identify as a reader with somebody, if it's in Afghanistan or if it's in Lesbos or wherever, who is having a Nutella bread in the morning, just in the same way like you. It can be these little bits, but that's what, keeps me going as a storyteller or reporter, where I'm saying, well, it's not emotional, because of course at the end of the day it's emotional because it's about humans, but it's a very factual debate what we are having, and that's why I think what Reem touched on in the beginning also, this is all facts that we are facing, right? And then this is, though, concerning the people who are affected. And I think as the media, we can also play a bit with this terminology, right? Like when, it was just coming to my mind when we are talking about crisis, in my head, the so-called refugee crisis is a crisis of solidarity, is a crisis of Europe, and the rule of law that we are facing right now, right? So it's always, this question is like, okay, from which angle do we look at the story? And I think this is just a reality we live in every day. This is the story of our time. Migration is the story of our time, as it always was and as it will be. And I think the storytelling plays an important part in it. And also to have the courage to leave open spaces and to listen to the silence in between. And maybe through that, you know, it's I don't know if it's easier, but it's more honest to draw attention also to this topic. And that's also where I say, okay, this is how we have to proceed forward as the media too. And always critically cycle back also and say, what were the lessons learned, and how do we face them today? Yeah.
And also, Michael, going back to what you said before, that basically the forgotten crisis of yesterday might be the very present and clear crisis of today. How do you make sense of that? That basically, what you're saying is that if you take the eyeballs off any problem, it might come back to haunt you. Is it possible to communicate that to policymakers?
Well, I think it is. I mean, it brings us back to chaos theory and the famous saying that the swinging of the wings of a butterfly can create a hurricane elsewhere. And this sounds very theoretical, like game theory, but in reality, I think 9/11 showed it. And in Germany, I'm German, of course, we had this debate, and the then Minister of Defense in Germany, Mr. Struck became famous by saying German security is defended at the Hindu Kush. There was a lot of emotion about that. Now, I don't want to discuss the statement that he made, but today I think we have a much broader consciousness in the political class, at least, and in civil society, that basically you need to defend your interests, but also your values worldwide. You cannot say, I can insulate myself from another part of the world. And therefore, I think it's also a bit strange to link this question about forgotten crises to the question of migration. There are forgotten crises that produce migration, there are others that don't produce migration. But sometimes, for example, sometimes there are forgotten crises that produce migration, but they don't get a lot of attention. Think of Haiti. Haiti produces a lot of migration, but I don't think that the world attention or world financial flows are directed to Haiti. And I could give you a similar example. So, the first thing is I think we need to intervene in those forgotten crises because of one simple issue, that is human suffering. It's our principle of humanity. And if we want to be human beings, we need to be caring about human beings, regardless of whether this is of immediate political importance, yes or no. And that is something which I think is very important and that policymakers, by and large, understand. The next question is how many resources would they make available? And then, yes, when we will have our next budgetary discussions, I will go to Peter, because he represents one of our member states, and the money comes from the member states, as he was so kind to remind us of. And I will tell him, listen, humanitarian aid is not only about humanity, it is also about, and I come back to what Adrian Najm told us, it's about global responsibility. And actually, as it so happens, we have many, many examples, and 9/11 was absolutely not the first one, that if we fail on global responsibility, it can haunt you. It comes back earlier than you think. And there is no such thing as something which is forgotten forever. There's no such thing as something that is basically neglected forever. Crises have a tendency of basically growing out of proportion. It's like the pressure cooker principle. Yeah? If you prepare your soup, so to say, and you use a pressure cooker, and then you get a phone call and go to the living room, all of a sudden the pressure cooker will explode, perhaps not in your face, but at least in your kitchen. And that is happening in so many international crises. I think that is a logic that, with everything that happened over the past couple of years, people have understood. They have understood very well, for example, in the area of health. Think of Ebola. Ebola was very early on not looked at a local Western or then Central African disease. The very fear that this might jump over to Europe, the United States and so forth, mobilized enormous financial resources. And the same thing happened then again with COVID. So if that logic can be made understandable in the case of infectious diseases, I think it can be made understandable also when it comes to political crisis. And although there is not enough awareness to this now, there's definitely more awareness than about 20 years ago.
And Peter, and I hope I understood Franziska correctly, but what you said was basically, okay, some crises that we think are other people's crises are actually our crisis. You put it like this. I mean, the refugee crisis is actually a crisis of Europe, a crisis of recipient countries where migrants go to deal with the problem. Is that what you basically said? So what do you make of that? That is not a forgotten crisis, it's our crisis, not somebody else's. Isn't that true? I mean, especially given what we saw in Greece?
I mean, if we look at the situation, we talk about a global situation. I mean, if we talk climate change, to take one of the challenges that are interlinked, I mean, if we talk conflict, you know, if we look at what the war of aggression against Ukraine led to globally, it was not only between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. It particularly affected the global south. If we look at what the COVID pandemic added to the scenario, sometimes I ask myself if we should not use the adjective overwhelming crisis, because maybe this is also something that is a challenge for us with regard to public awareness and public interest. Because I mean, if you look to the news, one of these challenges is always there. You know, you mentioned yourself declining interest with regard to Ukraine. So this all is also so closely interlinked these days. Conflict feeding off each other, creating migration, creating displacement. If you look at Sudan, we have many internally displaced at the moment, but where might it lead to? And we have to get prepared. I guess if you have here the international community sitting, we are all aware. And then there is this question, prioritizing, you know. I think the main priority are the people in need. There we have to say, I mean, even with our limited resources, we have to ask, and where do we make an impact, or where could we support best? Not only with regard to strategic planning, but also with regard to enable those that are helping, that they can plan, that they have the resources, or that we are giving funds to the instruments that can react rapidly, particularly with humanitarian crisis. The key is how quickly we can respond and how quickly we help. So these are the challenges that I guess have increased and are feeding off each other. And the question is, do we have, I mean, if we look on the debate that we are all facing, do we have enough funds available? This is not only a question of Austria and our limited funds, this is a question to the global community. Do we have enough funds? Do we react quickly enough to this crisis? And I mean, do we also react with regard to achievement of sustainable development goals? Because this is also important, an important role. Do we find the right answers? It's at the time needed. So, I mean, one major thing, and I think this is also clear, we do this based on the humanitarian principles: neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. So I think this is also a very important factor. But with regard to planifications, we have to work so to better and quicker respond.
Reem, you said before that the humanitarian community should not look what the news organizations are covering. You should do your thing. That's what you said. But still, I want to challenge you, of course, as a journalist, I should, because politics is, in my view, the stories we tell each other. Religion is, in my view, the stories we tell each other. So basically, our whole life is about storytelling. So I want to challenge you with that. Well, at least, you know, how can you do, when you do your thing, right? How do you tell that story so that it's not forgotten, that it gets out? Even if you think it shouldn't, you should not go after the, let's say, the donor's buck, because that's where the hot story is, so to speak. But still, you want to get it across that in some place where nobody's interested in at the moment, something's happening where you make an impact, where you make a difference, and you want the world to know about it.
Yeah. I think I'm going to take my MSF hat off a little bit.
Okay.
Just because I think that, just to echo a bit what Franziska said earlier, that I think that we shouldn't be afraid of truth, right? Few people have talked about our values and the importance of our values and humanitarian values and all our, you know, and I think that we also should be consistent in our values. Our values abroad, in which, you know, the idea that maybe humanitarian action is something we do away somewhere else in Africa, you know, and our values at home should not be so different, you know. And I think, to me today, this is what's at stake, and I see a contradiction in terms of the values abroad and the values at home, wherever that home is for people, right? And we see this tension in terms of today, that humanitarian work is kind of working in this tension of wanting to maintain a space for humanitarian values, but because our values at home, and I use the word because we all have different homes in this room, is about security and securitization. And that is the case in Europe, but it's also the case in Nigeria, it's also the case in Bangladesh, it's also the case in every country, just maybe manifested a little bit differently. And that today, for me, is something that is at stake, because we should be very clear about advocating and telling the story of why it is important to maintain the values that we have, why this tension between home and abroad is putting fundamentally the rule of law at stake and our societies at stake, and what that means just for others, but also what that means for us. And I think that, to be honest, that underlying story is not very well told. It's not very well told by humanitarians, and it's not very well told by journalists either. And I think that's fundamentally the story that we lose today. And then that manifests for different people in different extreme ways. For us, maybe we haven't seen the consequence so badly yet, but for others, that consequence has cost their lives. And that's where, you know, we need to be very clear, and where we then intervene and we respond to needs. But there is this bigger tension that's at play, that we should be able to tell this messy story. Mm. Well, no one else wanted to clap, just you.
No, Reem, thank you. At this point, I would like to open the floor to questions. So just raise your hand, and again, I remind you that we have a stream going, so please wait for the microphone until it's there. Here we go. Yeah, first row. Please.
Thanks for this great panel, and Reem, to you, but also to our colleague from MPI, really compelling points about people on the move, let's say migrants, internally displaced people. How do you draw attention, and also actually any of you who want to answer the question, how do you draw attention without setting off a narrative that could be harmful or at a minimum unconstructive? Thank you.
You want to take it?
Are we responding directly to each question? I think that that is a tricky thing to do, and I think it's something that we really need to be careful and aware of. And I think that comes back to the point I touched earlier about being careful not to talk about crises and using the language of crisis and how it's used. I think as well it's important for us to zoom out and tell the honest fact, because I think that, and as Bram highlighted in his speech, I think there's a lot of misinformation on migration. Right, and this misinformation on migration is also what leads to a lot of the negative narratives, and I think it's important that we correct those. And one of those misinformations is on climate change, right? I think there's a lot of emphasis on global displacement linked to climate, and of course we know that climate is a factor that will make some people need to move as an adaptation strategy. And I think it's important that we don't stigmatize this adaptation strategy and we don't overly construct or conflate that. And I think it's been used by a lot of climate activists in a very goodwill and good intention way to kind of be a wake-up call about the consequences of climate change. But this is actually leading to a securitization agenda, which will have an impact on the protection and safety of people that are moving. And so I think that we, as people that do tell stories, because I agree everything is about storytelling, that we are critical of the stories that we tell, and we think about the consequences, understanding the current environment that we live in, which is one of shrinking protections, unfortunately.
Maybe one additional thought, but I'm preaching to a convert, I'm sure. The problem is when we speak about migration, migration by all means reaches a lot of media attention. In reality, we speak about the tip of the iceberg, because we only speak about this 1% of global migration that reaches Europe or the United States. As you know better than I do, because you're working for IOM, 90% of all migration is south-south migration. It's actually internal displacement. Then another 9% is the kind of migration that Bram mentioned, you know, when people go from the Horn of Africa to Yemen because they want to gain Saudi Arabia. This is the unreported migration that enjoys hardly any visibility, and that means that hardly any resources are mobilized for that. Only the 1% that then unfortunately drown in the Mediterranean, they catch the attention. And they catch attention, which leads to capital flows, which leads to political energy, which leads to good things and bad things. The question is, how can we raise attention for the other 99%? Because that, again, is human suffering. There's, again, something which we cannot accept. And by the way, again, butterfly theory, much of this can lead to long-term destabilization. You know, when I took my present job, people told me, you know, Central Africa, very difficult, but there's one country where things go more or less all right, that's Burkina Faso. Because in Burkina Faso, you had about 100,000 internally displaced persons. That was 4 years ago. Now you have more than 3 million internally displaced persons. Right? And that, in a way, destabilizes an entire country, which leads to more destabilization of the entire region. That, again, will become a security problem for not only the region, but also for Europe and other countries. So, again, we have to think things together. There is no difference, so to say, in terms of the merit of mobilizing resources and public attention between those cases of migration that are being reported upon and those that are not. Because ultimately, this all leads to destabilization for everybody.
Please. And then the next one behind, yeah. Please.
Hi, firstly, thank you so much for the wonderful interventions. I'm Shad and I'm a PhD candidate here. And I just wanted to perhaps provide a comment or maybe a complication on what was being discussed and on the term of forgotten crises. So what I do is specifically looking at nationality-based aid in refugee policy and in refugee crises. And I think that one issue I might have with the way this is often framed is that it's assumed that the crises just stop at the border and we kind of forget about spillover effects. And so obviously we would not consider Syria to be a forgotten crisis, but the way it manifested in terms of the Jordan and Lebanon responses is that only Syrian refugees got funded in those contexts. And in both of those countries, this is outrageous because they are historical hosts, of course, of Palestinians, first and foremost, then Iraqis, more recently, Sudanese, Eritreans, Ethiopians, and so on. They are targets and refugee havens, if you want to call them that. So I suppose there, in this sense, how would you then also comment in terms of crises in this way, and in somewhat donor-biased language in terms of just where people are leaving from, but not necessarily where they're going? Thank you.
Yeah. I think, I kind of touched on that earlier, but I think we have to reinforce again the basics. I think we forgot the basics in humanitarianism somewhere along the way. I think we have to bring back humanitarian decisions that are informed by needs assessments, that are informed by, really, and rather than the politics and the donor framing. Of course, that's part of the landscape, and some organizations have to navigate that more than others. I'm in the liberty of working at an organization where we have a little bit more ability to navigate that space. But I think that, for me, it is concerning the way in which today, both in terms of nationality-based funding, nationality-based responses, but also nationality-based protection, and we take away that in a big crisis, and this is why I come back to forgotten crisis and humanitarian forgotten suffering don't necessarily equal each other, but in a big crisis, there's individual circumstance. So no two Syrian has the same protection needs and protection risks. No two person in any place in any country has that. And I think we need to still make space for our international system and our legal framework, which is actually what it provides, to allow for individual assessments, individual responses, knowing that sometimes you want to have group-based responses to fast-track some things, which is important as well. But that should not, we should be careful about that balance, right? And I think we should come back, again, coming back to the basics of our principles, which is independence and impartiality in humanitarian assistance. So that means that you do look at the needs and who needs them, not on, you receive because you fit this certain category and you don't because you don't fit that other category. So if we want to stick to the title of today, for me, these are non-negotiables, but somehow they have become negotiable in lots of contexts, maybe from that second line.
If I may, I would like to introduce one additional element. I think we need to be honest. We need to take into account the fact that many humanitarian decisions are being taken by non-humanitarians.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking here about funding flows, right? When did a lot of money come into the humanitarian sector here in Europe? And I'm sure this is true for Austria as well. In 2015. Why? Because of the arrival of the Syrians. Then we got another huge addition in 16-17 when the Central Mediterranean route was opened. Then we got another big top-up during the COVID period, and now because of Ukraine. Remember what happened when it's almost 2 years ago, the Taliban took over Kabul. Political leaders meet at the G7 level, in the United Nations, or at the European Council, and they say, what do we do? And they usually take two decisions in such situations. First, we impose sanctions against the bad guys. Therefore, we have this notion of de facto authorities. But we increase humanitarian aid because we don't want to punish the population. This happens very regularly now in major international crises. That means the humanitarian sector gets a lot of money that it actually has never asked for, because political leaders that are not specialists in humanitarian needs think that humanitarian needs should be satisfied as a package deal. Yeah? So, for the practitioners like me, but many others here in the room, the challenge is then to, in a way, satisfy those political orders without taking money away from the crisis that otherwise would be forgotten. And therefore, the challenge last year was, for example, to help the people in Ukraine without reshuffling the budget. And I'm personally moderately proud, I should say, that on the EU level, we managed to mobilize $500 million last year for Ukraine, but at the same time, we had record levels of expenditure for Yemen, for Afghanistan, for Mali, and so forth. So we didn't take it from the poor to help the other poor in Ukraine. But let's face it, humanitarian aid works in a political environment. Budgetary decisions are being taken not by the humanitarians, but by people who have a much more general view of what is the priority of a state or a community of states like the European Union. Somehow we have to juggle with these different balls. Therefore, something like a forgotten crisis index is important. And therefore, I spoke about imposing a self-discipline to say, yes, we can help in a political crisis, but not to the detriment of what would otherwise be forgotten.
Well, very briefly, 2 comments, just echoing what was said by Michael. We did the same. We did not only mobilize money for Ukraine, but also mobilize additional money for the crisis, because there is no other way of reacting. Second point, I think very important comment made, we have to take care, be it internally or externally, of the host communities, because this is very important with regard of support on all sides of these conflicts and crises. And because I see there are other questions, I will be very brief.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sarata. I'm a student and I'm currently doing an internship here. And I mean, I've heard that some of you struggle with the name of the panel, Forgotten Crisis. I also think it is a bit misleading, because I think people become too well adjusted to crisis. It's like there's like this indifference that somehow happens because people have somehow a capacity in dealing with those horrific pictures when you always consume the news. And I have an background. I was an activist in Germany for the Seebrücke, so I was really active there and also talking to people, and they would always mention, yeah, it's really hard to always deal with those pictures. And so my question would be maybe to Franziska, how do you deal with this when people are like really tired? I mean, it's a really privilege to be in a really privileged position to somehow say, yeah, I'm too tired to deal with those pictures, but somehow it is important. And how do you somehow keep that in mind to also get to those people? Because civil society is a really driving force in somehow drawing attention to certain matters. So how do you consider this in your reporting?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And I don't know if I have an answer on it, because it's also touching on the question you asked before. But I remember one photographer who once told me in 2015 and 16, she was saying, well, you know, in the media we did one mistake. We've only seen the boats arriving on the shores in Lesbos, but we haven't seen how they departed. And we haven't seen the homes that people have left and what they left behind, and the parents they might have left behind because they were too old to go with them, and so on and so forth. So I think it's always a matter of perspective, and I think it's also a very political issue, and I think that's why it concerns us all. And I think in this case also, I have a lot of questions always also in the humanitarian field, right? Because it's so political, it's so interlinked, and so many crises are also orchestrated, to be fair and to be honest about that as well. If we look back on the, let's say, and I'm focusing all the time back on Europe, but let's say in the last years when we saw the camps in Europe, for example, I mean, we had a situation that for 4 or 5 winters, the humanitarian organizations in Moria, for example, in Europe's biggest camp for people who arrived in Europe seeking safety, they were always questioning in October and September, it's raining, it's going to rain again, and then the tents are going to slide down, and you know, you constantly have the same questions, and knowing that there was a reality where if there is a flooding, for example, in Germany, we do have the capacity to help 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people within 2 or 3 afternoons to at least shelter them safely. So I think this is also a question that has to be combined with all of this. It's like how often do crises also get manufactured from a political level? And then I think my answer, and to answer your question again, is that there is a responsibility to look at this and to combine these different elements of drawing the perspectives from different corners, but also, again, to also look at the political sphere that's very much interlinked with the humanitarian one and the moral one. And also, and I don't want to sound too cliche, but I think interlinking it with the question in what kind of world we want to live in. And I think that consequently should concern all of us.
I mean, just because you mentioned it, isn't also that a problem that we saw more and more, let's call it humanitarian blackmail, maybe even starting 2015, because it was not by chance that suddenly hundreds and thousands of refugees on foot walked towards Austria from Budapest. What role did Viktor Orban play in this? Or we remember the Belarusian-Polish border. I mean, we have more and more of these kind of, let's say, humanitarian blackmail, where also I want to ask my panel what to do about that. Because this is, you clearly stated it, this is what's happening.
Can I say something about
Yes, please.
I think we have to be very careful with this language of instrumentalization and blackmailing. I think that you could only be, something can only be used against you once you commodify it, right? So, you know, and what we've seen and again, the point of the panel was not to focus on European migration, but I think we see this as well in other regions. It's not just unique to Europe, but what we've seen is that the policies have been to outsource the responsibility to other countries to be holding pens. So now in this context, migrants not only become a commodity, but they also become a threat, right? So once you are so afraid of a very few number of people, because even when people crossed from the Belarusian border into Central Europe, it was not, by no means was it a crisis, but it becomes a crisis when you close your border and you block people in a 2K radius from your border zone. You know, and you leave them there and you criminalize people trying to support them. And that's when people don't have access to food. That's when people are trapped in the forest, and that's when people die. You know, if you have a different response, which is one of reception, you know, a different response, which is actually addressing the, you know, and providing assistance, then your enemy no longer has something to blackmail you with. And this language of instrumentalization is becoming all too common in Europe. And why I want to respond to this is because today European states are negotiating the new migration pact, and still on the table is discussions on the issue of instrumentalization, or as you called it, humanitarian blackmailing. It's not I think we should detach the word humanitarian from that sentence completely.
Just like humanitarian intervention, right?
Yeah,
Remember that one.
Exactly. But it's the same thing. It's this linking of securitization agendas with assistance, which is problematic. So it's the exact same root problem, whether it's just in the context of migration. And what will happen because of this knowledge is actually, instead of not allowing that this becomes a threat or perceived as a threat and seeing humans as weapons in this context, actually what they're doing is doubling down on this because it will allow for more degregations, more militarization of the border, you know, it will allow for more zones of exclusion and exception and states of emergency. So it only will lead to scenarios where you can even be more further instrumentalized. So it's kind of like I think Bram said it, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is why I come back to the point that I raised earlier, which is you cannot defend your values if you do not have the same values at home and abroad. You know, it's a contradiction. And this is today what we see. And so coming back to maybe having a more global perspective, you know, I think it's very important that we are consistent in the way in which we see not just migration and displacement issues, but also how we address conflicts, how we address issues of food security, how we address the future pandemics and public health issues, that these are issues that are rooted in, I would not say global security, because I think that reinforces, but global well-being, you know? And so unless we actually see that these things are rooted in having to have cooperation, shared responsibility that is linked to global well-being, then I don't think we are going to be in a better place than we are today.
Yes. Here.
Thank you very much. Tigran Zakarian from the Armenian Embassy. There was a very short reference to Nagorno-Karabakh. With your permission, just a very short remark. Forgotten status can indeed be interpreted differently, but a very common and I think simple formula could be the amount of humanitarian assistance provided to those affected in crisis areas. I'm telling this because right now thousands of forcefully displaced persons in Nagorno-Karabakh as a result of the Azerbaijani war of aggression in 2020 are completely cut off from the external world. And as a result of the blockade of the only line of road, Lachin corridor. From the political point of view, of course, this forgotten status and the lack of proper, adequate international response to perpetrators is the main factor encouraging them, in this case Azerbaijan, to feel this sense of impunity and to continue its policy of discrimination, ethnic cleansing, and aggression. That's why international mechanisms also present on the ground, and their vigorous enforcement are critical to restrain perpetrators, Azerbaijan, to uphold their own legal obligations under international humanitarian law. Thank you.
And then back there was the second one, I think. Yes, please.
Doesn't work? It works. My name is Christophe Dumalin. I'm from Red Noses International. And I was wondering something because we were talking, thank you, it was really very interesting what you were talking about. And we talk a lot about money and about security and about food and about everything which is necessary. And I was wondering because I like so much the poster because you write human in red, very important, and I like it a lot because we're talking about human beings and not only about humanitarian situations. And I liked very much in the beginning of your keynote, Reem, that you were talking about the suffering and about the human beings. And human beings are emotional creatures, and they have emotions. And what is about the suffering of them, and what is about the psychosocial health of them. And I was wondering why we talk not so much about it, because in our work we feel it and we see it all the time. Is the fear, it's this broken generation of children which think that living in a refugee shelter is normal. A lot of children are born in refugee shelters. So what about this generation of young people that later will be adults and wander in the world? And why we don't talk so much about it? For me, it's an important question. Thank you.
Shall I say something?
Yes, please.
I think that's a very important question, and I hope we do still talk about it. It always depends on the context, right? And I think that's really where and I mentioned in the beginning that we have a problem with press freedom at the moment in Europe. And when it comes to covering topics on migration, for example, when you're working in the organization with youth, with children, you also depend on getting access to the places where people live, where people stay. And in my experience, these places have really shrinked in the last years. You could see this in Greece, you could see this, I was a couple of weeks ago, I was in Lampedusa, I couldn't really talk to the people just through a fence. I have seen this on the border between Belarus and Poland. I have seen it now in Niger during a research in February, and I've also seen it in Bangladesh to some extent. It's very difficult to get in touch with people, and I think this is also the people who are actually the ones who are affected by the policies and all the things we're talking about today. And I think this is really also the job of the media to keep a foot in the door. And I think there's also a linkage between humanitarian organizations and the media to allow these spaces to still be open, because also what we have witnessed in the last years, for example, in Greece, there is an atmosphere of fear sometimes to speak out. There is an atmosphere of not knowing where can I go, when might I lose my, not reference, but my allowance to work in the space if I speak out too much. You know, that's also something we talked about, responsibility. Also for journalists, I think this is a very big issue. Who do I expose? Who might I expose too much? So this is something that I think is a joint debate that should always have the human in the focus, right? And that's why I'm very grateful that you also keep a foot in the door, and through your work, make people still visible.
I would also like to add my voice. You said something extremely important. We have a humanitarian language which is almost inhumane. We speak about humanitarian caseload, for example, as if it was a cargo. Rubbish. We are speaking about human beings. We're speaking about children. I make it a point that basically every other month at least I go into a refugee camp, I speak with the people and so forth. And I think this is important for decision makers, it's important for journalists and others. However, every time I do that, I come back, and I'm very honest with you now, I come back with a schizophrenic impression. First thing I say, great, you have the best job in the world, you can make these people survive. But then I'm also close to some sort of mental suicide, to be honest, because as it was said this morning, as humanitarians, you can make people survive for a week, for another week, for a month, maybe for a year. You cannot do anything about fighting the root causes, and you cannot give them a long-term future. And every time I speak to somebody who is a refugee or internally displaced, I'm impressed by the realism of these people and the knowledge about the complexity of their situation. About 2 years ago, I was at an event where the United Nations had brought together all the so-called humanitarian coordinators. So the humanitarian coordinators in each of the countries where the United Nations operate with humanitarian aid. And we were discussing, again, our language, so-called accountability to the beneficiaries, terrible word. There was one interesting thing that all said, and this corresponds also to my own experience. We have a big problem. When you go to somebody who receives humanitarian aid and ask, what can we do better? What can we do more to help you? We always receive an answer that goes beyond humanitarian aid. People will ask for education for their kids. They will ask for jobs. When I went to a refugee camp or IDP camp in Yemen about a year ago, I had a meeting with only the women in the camps. And I said, what can we do better to help you? And I would expect an answer about, well, we need to have more childcare, we need to have a kindergarten, we need to have the... They said, we need jobs for our husbands. We are fine on healthcare, we are fine on kindergartens, but we need jobs for our husbands because the husbands are precarious day workers. But if they have a better income, then we can buy better food and we can construct a future for our families. Now, this is where I come to the limits of what I can do as a humanitarian. Of course, I could dedicate money for a job creation program, livelihoods, and we do this sometimes. But then I have not enough money for the food rations. And we heard this morning that the World Food Programme has to cut rations, for example, in Bangladesh, and in Palestine, and in Jordan, and so forth. So, in a way, I'm constantly frustrated because I have the feeling you have to fight against a huge wall, and there's no chance. It's a Don Quixote-like situation. You fight against the windmill. There's no chance, basically, to improve the situation. And I think that makes it complex. We must avoid a situation where people say, this is so difficult that, you don't better even start. Because that would mean that we don't even do the things that we can do, and that is to save people's lives and to ease their suffering right now. So we are in an extremely complex environment, and the more you get into it, and the more you face reality, the more you are aware of the complexity. And I think that is something very, very difficult to transport for the media, because you are in the business of simplifying, otherwise you cannot transport a message, I think. So I think one has to be a little bit aware of this complexity so that we don't create too many false expectations.
Peter?
Well, it's very difficult, in such a complex topic to summarize up all your thoughts, particularly after the debate, and I think you made an excellent summary of our state of mind working in this. But I would like just to thank all of you for being part of this debate, because not only the debate, you and what you are doing on a daily basis, and I think what we are doing on a daily basis, in a way is inspiring when you have these schizophrenic thoughts. And I said, I take the optimism that was reflected in your statement with me, because I think, even as you said, we are maybe making not a difference for all, but we are making a difference for some. And I think this is the biggest motivation you can have to help human beings. I think what for me is also a fact, we are talking about individual human beings and not groups of migrants, displaced persons, whatever we call them, and that is, I think, the inspiring idea I take with me, and I thank you for being on the panel.
Reem?
Maybe just to respond a bit to the question, I think that the mental health issue and the psychosocial well-being of people is the forgotten suffering and the forgotten crisis and the forgotten suffering. I think that we've gotten better in the humanitarian landscape, but I think still mental health and the kind of well-being of people from that perspective is a very difficult topic to address. And I think we have to be careful not to address it only from a super biomedical, clinical way, because in the end of the day, it's about how do we move from a politic of survival to a politic of where we think people have the right to thrive, even if they are in the midst of conflict, even if they are in the midst of desperation. And I don't think we're at the politics of thriving yet. We're still at the politics of surviving, and sadly, the politics of surviving is shrinking. So I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but on the mental health question, what we've learned working more and more on mental health in conflicts and migration crises globally is that the mental health of people gets worse the more their context is contained. So there's many studies that have come out that are longitude studies that show that we know that mental health of people in any context, even in conflicts, is very severe, but then oftentimes if we compare that to the mental health of people in closed detention settings, oftentimes we see much high levels of mental health suffering and self-harming and deaths as a result of that mental health suffering in those contexts. And why? The why is because in those contexts of containment and invisibilization, we've completely dehumanized people, and we've completely detached people from any ability to create spaces for social cohesion and for their own agency to be fully expressed. And so it comes back to, again, we talked about fundamental values, and I think a fundamental value for all of us, and if you look at the Charter of Human Rights and things like this, we know is the right to dignity, we know is also the right to us to express ourselves, to have agency, and those rights should not be reduced just because someone happens to live in the midst of a conflict, or just because someone happens to be a refugee, or happens to be a migrant, or happens to have the audacity to seek protection and safety in Australia or America or Europe. And I think that's what is at stake today, and I think at the heart of that is, and the biggest consequence is on people's mental health.
So thank you very much. It's time to wrap up this panel. Thank you so much to the panelists, to the audience. Thanks for your question, and also a special shout out to the technical team, who also should not be forgotten in our applause. So a warm round of applause for everybody who's making it possible.